Hello everyone, I'm Flip Padeau, host of Old Bull TV and founder of American Civics Exchange. Rachel is on her way out, but I hope you'll indulge me for just a minute to say a few words about this premiere of The Election Whisperer. We've been working very hard on it, and we appreciate that so many of you have already reached out with your suggestions, questions, and support. If you're new to Old Bull TV, we are a channel devoted to innovation in political forecasting, finding new and better methods of predicting outcomes to help you make better decisions for your families, your businesses, and your ballot. The best part about that is that we get to elevate and celebrate new voices and perspectives. And the host and co-creator of The Election Whisperer, Rachel Bitecofer, Senior Fellow for Elections at the Niskanen Center, is one of the most unique and innovative forces in political forecasting today. She's going to make you think, make you laugh. At some point, she's going to make you mad. And one of the things we like best about her is that she has a perspective. You can call it a bias, an ideology, that doesn't much matter. What does matter is that she doesn't hide it or apologize for it. That alone sets her apart from just about every ostensibly nonpartisan media outlet, election forecaster, and sabermetrician in business today. Any analyst that doesn't wear their ideology on their sleeve is lying to you, and you should be highly suspect of their analysis. Now, for our part, Old Bull is neither left nor right. Our only goal is to help you get better at predicting the future. Rachel doesn't pretend to be nonpartisan, and she doesn't hail from the mainstream media data journalism clubhouse, but she has proven herself better at predicting the future than just about all who do. That's part of why Dr. Bitecofer, our unapologetically left-leaning host, is this Republican's favorite election forecaster. Her methods are different, her style is different. Rather than knocking on the door of that clubhouse and offering polite criticism, she commandeers a bulldozer to knock the clubhouse down. That's what she's doing here today, and we're just thrilled that she's doing it with us. Rachel has been moving at 1,000,000 miles an hour from day one on this, and you will not believe the lineup of guests that she's bringing you. So please take a couple of seconds to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a minute. Welcome to The Election Whisperer. I'm so glad you can join us. Rachel, take it away.
Welcome to the very first episode of The Election Whisperer. I'm your host, Rachel Bitecofer. I am so delighted to be launching this show. It's going to be such a pleasure. Smart data analysis for smart people. This show is a long time coming. I think it's going to be a great format. It's going to be on YouTube, so highly visual, not just a podcast, though you can certainly watch it that way or listen to it that way. I highly recommend, though, the YouTube version. I'm going to be bringing my classroom to an audience. I'll be using lots of visuals, database stuff. So I think you really want to use the YouTube version. So excited to partner with Old Bull TV and Flip Padeau. I think you guys are really going to enjoy this show. I think the premiere episode is going to be great. I have Kyle Kondik coming on from Crystal Ball, like me, an election nerd. We're going to both be talking about the Veepstakes. Kyle has a piece out ranking potential candidates. I, of course, put my New York Times op-ed out a couple weeks ago, right before, of course, the George Floyd murder backlash stuff happened. So we'll be talking about how that might have affected Biden's calculus. I think it's going to be a really great conversation, a couple of wonks, just kind of hammering out Biden's options and the atmosphere and how that might affect things. We have a really good Q&A session. We've been soliciting questions from you over the last couple of weeks since we announced the show from our mailbag on the website, which is, of course, at electionwhisperer.com. We're still taking questions there. If your question didn't get addressed in this episode, that doesn't mean it won't get addressed. We have a lot of special topic episodes coming up, so it might be in there. And we are, of course, still taking questions, so please submit. And of course, after this episode, we have for the premiere, a special live airing. And right after that, we're going to have a live Q&A with me on YouTube. So if you're watching this live at the premiere, then please join us for that Q&A. UVA, and you'll get your questions answered there. So I'm really excited to engage with you guys there. Please stop sending me questions on Twitter. If you want questions answered, send them for the show, because it gives me great ideas of topics that you guys are really caring about or curious about, and what we need to talk about on the show. I wanted to kind of give you a rundown of what to expect on this show, because there's never been a show like it. And I think you guys are really going to love it. I mean, again, it's a show for election nerds. It's election nerd Disneyland. And even the people that are going to be on it, who you see on other shows, are going to be interviewed very differently about different topics than I think you're used to seeing them talk about. Like, take, for example, episode 2. That's got Rick Wilson coming on, and Rick's been all over the place. As you guys know, Rick is the mastermind behind the Lincoln Project ads. I'm a senior advisor on the Lincoln Project, and the Lincoln Project has been catching a lot of attention with their taunting Trump ads, go both on digital and on main TV. So Rick will be on, but I will not be bringing him on so much to talk about Lincoln Project, though we will talk about a little bit. What that episode's called, the Lean Mean GOP Campaign Machine. And what we're going to be talking about is how the GOP does electioneering, because they do it quite differently than how Democrats do it. And I don't know that everyone is aware of that. If you're a longtime follower of me, you'll probably know it, because I rant and rave about how much better the GOP is at electioneering than Democrats. And so we're going to talk about just what that means. Like, what are the mechanics of how the GOP campaigns, and we're going to have Rick take us into that dark underbelly of the effective chess game that is GOP electioneering. Most people would be shocked, I think, to find out that there's actually less Republican voters in Florida than there are Democrats, and that's been true for a long time. And yet, Florida Republicans win statewide elections there over and over again. How do they do it? So we're going to talk about that. In the third episode, I have Ben Wickler coming on. Ben is the state party chair for Wisconsin, and he just took that party through a very successful election cycle, kind of an against all odds scenario. If you remember correctly, a few weeks ago, Wisconsin was dominating headlines as it went through a forced election after the state Republican Party there sued the Democratic governor and forced him to hold the election, which was a Democratic primary for the presidential, but also on that ballot was going to be a race for the state Supreme Court. And the Republicans felt like, okay, they had bad odds because of the state Supreme Court race being on a Democratic contested primary ballot, and there was no Republican primary that was competitive. And they felt like a chance, if we have this pandemic, maybe turnout will be weird and this will help us, to kind of offset a really big disadvantage. So they sued to force the Democratic governor to hold this contest at the height of the pandemic. So it captured a lot of national news, and they had the pandemic or the election in the pandemic, and it made a lot of news coverage because people were voting in these really suboptimal conditions. And then it made even more news when the Democratic candidate trounced the Republican incumbent by 11 points, or maybe even a little bit more, and that was really stupendous because in these state Supreme Court races, I don't think an incumbent judge there had been beaten in many, many years, perhaps decades. So Ben was the mastermind behind that campaign strategy. We're going to be talking about that and getting a sneak peek at the Wisconsin strategy for the fall. And then the third episode, I want to kind of get you guys thinking about state legislative elections, because that's something that Republicans have been very smart about, very shrewd. In 2010, they laid preemptively a plan of having a very dominant election cycle in 2010 with the intention of taking control of as many state legislative seats and chambers as possible so that they could control reapportionment and redistricting. You've heard those words before because they're connected to gerrymandering. And of course, partisan gerrymandering is a huge issue in our politics. So we're going to be bringing on Jessica Post, who's in charge of the Democratic effort to win state legislative elections nationwide, and hearing about Democrats' efforts to win back state legislative races and to flip some of these state legislative chambers. in time in the 2020 cycle to reverse some of these partisan gerrymanders. So it's going to be a great episode. I'm really excited about that one as well. And then, just to get you really excited, I've got two specials set up for the party conventions that are just going to be star-studded spectaculars. And I'm going to hold back who is going to be involved and what we're going to be doing. But I'm just telling you, you should pop your popcorn and get your cheesy poofs ready because it's going to be a fantastic month there. Okay. Kyle Kondik, welcome to the Election Whisperer premiere. I'm so excited to have you on. You're a mad genius when it comes to election analysis, so I couldn't think of a better person to have on my debut show to talk about the Veepstakes, the hottest topic, I think, right now. It's the one thing that people cannot stop obsessing over. And of course, Biden's going to make us sweat it out, right, to probably a few weeks before the convention. So I'm excited to have you on the show, and I wanted to kind of start off by having you walk our viewers through the crystal ball rankings that you guys released a couple of weeks ago and where you guys see the race for the VP right now.
Rachel, first, congrats on the show, and thank you for having me here. And we actually wrote about this a little bit, that I think it makes perfect sense for Biden to wait, just because historically that's how it's really always been done, that the VP picks are announced basically no sooner than like 3 weeks before the election. And that was I think that was John Edwards in 2004 with John Kerry. Right. And so, but also you give the election more time to kind of settle and you sort of figure out what's going to be important for the fall. And I just think about a hypothetical in which, Biden decided to announce Amy Klobuchar as his running mate, hypothetically, even maybe offering it to her in exchange for her endorsement back in March, and how bad that would look now, given what happened in Minneapolis and her connection to that situation up there. And of course, Klobuchar recently pulled herself out of the running, although it kind of seemed like the writing was the writing was on the wall anyway.
Right.
We're not going to have this pick for a while. It is something that I think a lot of people just love to talk about, and we love to write about. And so our most recent list that we did last week, we had Kamala Harris number one, which again, I think is probably kind of a consensus opinion, which maybe leads me to think that she actually won't be picked, but I don't think who would be in her place. I don't know. But we have Kamala Harris, we have Val Demings, the congresswoman from Florida, who's a former police chief, Tammy Duck from Illinois, Michelle Lujan Grisham from New Mexico, the governor there, and Keisha Lance Bottoms, the Atlanta mayor, who I think has become much more of a prominent figure at this point. And I think what's notable about that list is that the top 5 names on our list are all non-white women.
Right.
I think Amy Klobuchar, when she exited the race, she suggested that Biden select a non-white woman. It seems like maybe it's an idea whose time has come, but we'll just have to wait and see. Elizabeth Warren is probably still in the mix, and there are a number of other folks. When we do these lists, I'm just kind of hoping that the eventual pick is on the list, because ultimately Biden himself probably doesn't even know who he's picking at this point. And even if he did, I think it's probably going to be a closely held secret. But, based on a lot of the reporting and the vetting information, I think we have a good idea of sort of who's in the mix and who's not.
Yeah, I think so. And I think I wanted you to kind of walk through that list. I mean, number one, I really would urge anybody who's viewing this who hasn't been to the Crystal Ball website, which I think are probably pretty few people, but just in case there's anyone out there, please go there. The election analysis on that website is just, second to none. It's great stuff. And, but one thing I would say is this is a very different list than we would have seen a year ago, because it is 5 non-white candidates. And I think that it is probably, an easier, just from when my New York Times article came out on the Tuesday, a few Tuesdays ago, right when the George Floyd backlash to George Floyd's murder was starting to build up, but had yet to really fully erupt. I was, trying to make this argument about how Biden needed to really recognize the diversity of the Democratic coalition racially and ideologically. And now, as that next 3 weeks developed, it's such a much more obvious choice, right? That this list, is dominated by non-white candidates. And a year ago, of course, Klobuchar, Whitmer, candidates like that would have been, much more prime up on that list, and it's a real testament to how much, as you were saying, to lock in early on a choice would not be wise, as much as fundamentals for many things in the polarized era can set in pretty early. VP selection is not one of them. I mean, you just don't know what kind of conditions you're going to be looking at as you run into the fall. And when something like this, nobody could have predicted that Black Lives Matter would go from, stuck in this like 42, 43%, I would call like polarized opinion zone, to suddenly a mainstream, mainstream movement issue, right? Something that has, transformed American politics. We only see something like this come around every 20 or 30 years, if that, in American politics. So it's really something.
And Rachel, to your point, and I think we're both sort of the belief that there are lots of factors in an election that the candidates themselves really can't control.
Right.
I mean, for as much as the incumbent president maybe gets blame or credit for the state of the economy and other things, they're not really pulling the levers on that as much as maybe one might think, based on voting patterns. And, also the state of the economy maybe isn't as much of a driver of voting as maybe it was a generation or two ago, because of some of the dynamics of polarization and whatnot. But there is at least one big thing that a candidate can control, and that is who the running mate is.
Right.
And it's one of the relatively few cards that candidates can play, and you want to make sure you do the best you can on it. Now, and again, I'm also not sitting here saying that the VP choice is an earth-shattering kind of thing. I mean, I think that there's some research that indicates that a running mate can be worth, some small number of bonus points in that person's home state, and that effect probably isn't as dramatic as maybe it once was. I also think that the VP choice can sort of help sort of set the tempo of the ticket, can balance the ticket in certain ways, and certainly for Biden, who is a older white candidate who's been around for a long time. He has described his own candidacy as representing something of a bridge to the future of the Democratic Party. The VP choice helps say what that, who the bridge person is, because we don't really even know if Biden is going to run again in 4 years if he were elected. And this person who gets picked as the running mate could be the Democratic presidential nominee as soon as 4 years from now, or in all likelihood be at least a strong contender for a Democratic presidential nomination down the road. And so it's not only is it important in the context of this election, it's also important in the context of the future of the Democratic Party. And this person is going to be an even bigger leader in the party than she is now. And in some instances, if the person elevated is a relative unknown, like Val Demings from Florida or Michelle Lujan Grisham, that person is going to go from relative obscurity. People like you and me know who they are, but many others don't, to being one of the leading figures, not only in the Democratic Party, but in American politics. So that's an important thing. And for Biden camp, when you're vetting these folks, you have to ask yourself, will this person, wear well on the national level? Will this person perform when they maybe haven't had to perform on nearly as big of a stage? And that is maybe an argument for choosing someone who is sort of already more of a household name, like Elizabeth Warren or Kamala Harris, just because we've already seen them perform on the national level. Now, you could say, well, maybe they didn't perform all that well, and that's something you can discuss, but at least they have experience with it, and at least they've been vetted to some degree by the national press, whereas I think some of these other candidates really haven't.
Yeah, I mean, and I just think our VP conversation is haunted by a couple of things. Number one, I think the overall analysis world and campaign practitioner world, as I frustratingly point this out all the time, hasn't grasp the two eras concept or framework all that well, where we've moved into this polarized era, and although people are quick to accept it, we're in this polarized era, we have polarized politics, not everybody understands that means empirical differences in the way that behavior occurs for elites, in the way institutions operate, in the way that people behave in the mass public. And so therefore a VP of fact that may not have been pertinent it before in a situation where factionalization is a big problem within the parties. Being having Pence come in and marry this factionalized base of the Republican Party might have been really crucial for Trump, right? A olive branch out to that Democratic bridge, as I argued in the op-ed, is maybe more important than it would have been 20 years ago in a non-polarized era, because these polarization isn't just a buzzword, it's an empirical trait that we can see through all of these different aspects of the world, institutionally, individual behavior, and so on and so forth, right? So I think people psychologically are really affected by the Sarah Palin pick, right? Because you had McCain in a circumstance like Trump is in now, trailing in extraordinary circumstances. An economic collapse is unfolding in his candidacy. He bears the stain of that incumbent presidency, and he's looking at this insurgent candidate who's got this wonderful change candidacy case, because he's not only coming as the opposition party, but also as bringing in this mantra of I am the first African American president, right? And so the Biden campaign or the McCain campaign comes up with this idea of trying to negate or neutralize that change argument by nominating a female vice president, and the strategy itself wasn't flawed necessarily. It's that they got fooled into somebody who on the surface looked really nice and shiny, but they didn't vet it well. And I think that's probably why, like, we think of Harris as such a strong contender. Somebody like Harris or Warren, who have been out on that national stage so much and have had so much exposure, have had so many of their skeletons already dredged out, versus someone like a Demings or like a mayor of Atlanta, who are just coming into the national conversation now. I think that would make the Biden campaign pretty cautious. And I certainly would never compare Mayor Bottoms or Val Demings to Sarah Palin in terms of competency. But because they have not been vetted, have not been in this debate stage, have not had opposition research dug out on them, I think the Biden team would probably lean more towards somebody like Harris, who has had all of those things and much time to kind of, marinate in the political process at the national level.
Yeah, I agree with that. And, again, typically running mate selections do have a fair amount of formal elected experience, either in the House or the Senate, more likely the Senate, particularly on the Democratic side. I think 15 of the last 18 Democratic VP picks have been senators, which is kind of amazing that it's been so dominated by senators, or folks for state governors. That the Republican side historically is a little bit more diverse in terms of backgrounds. Pence was a governor and a House member. Paul Ryan was a sitting House member, which Ryan was one of the kind of few sitting House members to be directly elevated. But of course, he was someone who already had a national profile. In some ways, he was one of the major faces of the Republican Party. Even at the time he was selected in 2012, he became the face of, there was the Ryan budget and something that Democrats are running against. But going back to Pence, I think both you and I probably think that Pence ended up being a pretty good selection by Trump for the reasons you cite, in that it helped unify his party. And we know that white evangelical Christians are such a huge part of the Republican voting bloc, and an overwhelmingly Republican bloc. And in fact, if you believe the exit polls, I think this is probably true, that Trump did even better amongst white evangelicals in 2016 than George W. Bush did in 2004. I mean, it was close, but it was about 80% of the vote both times. And does that happen without Pence? I mean, maybe it does anyway. It's these things are you don't really know who the alternative would have been. And ultimately, a lot of those voters who are social conservatives anyway may have come home to Trump. But Pence was probably at least a little bit helpful in reassuring those voters. And, then you have to think about, who is Biden trying to reassure? I mean, I guess I personally think that on one hand, you could say he's trying to reassure the left. But I think that to the extent that there are Bernie Sanders supporters who don't back Biden, I don't know if there's any choice amongst the top contenders for Biden's VP that he could choose that would actually satisfy that part of the electorate, besides Sanders himself, who obviously is not going to be selected. I guess you would think Warren maybe, but even during the campaign, it seemed like there was a lot of, it sort of started out, people were saying, oh yeah, Warren and Sanders backers are the same kinds of people. Well, they weren't really. And by the end, there was a lot of bitterness between the two camps anyway. And I also think Warren probably is a little bit less likely to be selected anyway. But the bottom line is that if you think that Biden has to present some sort of olive branch to kind of the hard left, I don't think that's even necessarily even possible, particularly with the names that are being discussed now.
Yeah, so I don't actually see it that way. I don't see it as like, so there is a slither of like the Bernie base, like the Bernie bro base that defected in 2016, probably will defect in 2020 as well. They'll either vote third party right in Sanders or sit out the election. And I think we saw like their potential like electoral strength in the 2018 Arizona Senate race, which was an extremely competitive race, a very important race for Democrats to win. The Green Party candidate, after pressure and recognizing her spoiler potential, withdrew from the race, begged her followers not to cast protest ballots, endorse the Democrat sentiment in that race, and yet still about 2% of voters voted for the Green Party candidate there, right? Sinema ended up winning, I think largely due to a little bit of extra burst that was atypical amongst like GOP crossover voting. And that's that McCain Republican Arizona vote, which is a little special extra burst of never Trump that you get in Arizona. But it could have been decisive. It could have spoiled the race. And so to me, there's probably about 1.8, 1.6% of that potential left vote that would never vote for anybody but a Bernie Sanders out and out socialist AOC type candidate. But those aren't the people that like I think a olive branch type candidate would appeal to. A Harris, an Abrams, certainly somebody who's not a socialist or an extremist, but somebody who is at least a nod to the liberal wing of the party. And really, I'm talking about voters who are under the age of 30, under the age of 40, who are really growing up in a media ecosystem that is very different from the types that you and I experienced, people who are above us in age, and they're growing up in a media ecosystem that has really never exposed them to traditional formats of media. And they really do have a perception that there's not much difference between Trump and Biden, that there's not much difference between the Democratic and Republican platforms. And there really isn't much opportunity for them to get exposed to a different message, right? They are getting news and information from places like, progressive Sirius satellite radio and, the Joe Rogans of the world. And, and I think you need to give them some inspiration to see that bridge. Like you can't just tell them there's going to be a bridge to the future and then put, Gretchen Whitmer on the ticket and, they're seeing two double white moderates, right? So I think you have to actually build at least some part of that bridge for them to see it.
Also there is a lot of compelling research, and my friend Ted Johnson at the Brennan Center has written about this, and we had him on a panel at Center for Politics last month talking about the VP choice, and Ted was talking about just that we know from research that if Biden were to select an African American running mate, right, there is some suggestion that could be electorally helpful in terms of turnout. And I think that maybe that's possible too if you would select a Hispanic running mate, Asian American running mate, et cetera. But the research isn't as strong as it is for African Americans, because African Americans are just kind of more of a cohesive voting block. That's not to say that all African American voters are the same and are going to vote the same way, but that there might actually be some electoral benefit there that maybe there wouldn't be if Biden did not go with a black running mate. And so that's also something that you can actually, I think, look at from political science and say, well, if Biden is looking for some sort of electoral benefit, particularly, really all the swing states, or almost all of them, have significant black voting blocks. I mean, even right, states like Wisconsin that we think of as being lily white, part of the reason they couldn't get over the finish line is because turnout in Milwaukee maybe wasn't yes, as good. And that's that there are a fair number of black voters in Milwaukee, and states like Ohio and Michigan and Pennsylvania, et cetera. And then even more so if Democrats are trying to win North Carolina and Georgia, which are states that in some ways are trending positively for Democrats, but I think are still right of center. Obviously those states are very significantly African-American too. And so from an electoral standpoint, that's one, clear electoral benefit that well, maybe not clear, but you might expect a black running mate to be able to help Biden generate a little bit better turnout, which is pretty important.
Yeah, and it's but basically it's clear to like the two divides in the electoral strategy world of Democratic politics. There's the old school and the new school, right? And the new school says, look, you look at Milwaukee, Detroit, Philly, Pittsburgh, places like that, and you replicate the Obama coalition, and those states are all flipping back to the Democrats. And then when you look at Georgia and North Carolina, they have value on the electoral college map for the POTUS races, but ultimately North Carolina is the pivot race for the Senate control. I mean, the map to the Senate goes through Arizona, Colorado, and Maine, and those seats are very winnable. But ultimately, you need to offset that Alabama loss probably, and the way to do it is going to be North Carolina. Unless Kansas nominates Kobash, and then maybe that's as competitive. But North Carolina with a African American on the presidential ticket is one story. Same with the Georgia Senate race there. It's a totally different story without an African American on the ticket. Though, Warren with the ideological diversity, could also probably boost turnout. So, I think ultimately it's about whether you're seeing the old map, which is kind of like, okay, there's a share of white voters and we must dominate a certain percent of them, or if you're looking at it kind of like the new Democratic majority politics, right? Like the way I solve equation, like the political math is always the same. What is the percent of the Democratic coalition turnout versus Republican coalition turnout? And I want to always equalize that Republican turnout because I know how high it's going to be. So if I want to win, that's what I'm interested in solving. So it's a very turnout based approach to politicking, but the old model that's not how Democratic consultants and electioneering is really done. So it's a very different approach.
Well, I also think that it is important to take the kind of the white vote in aggregate into account here, in that I think there's room for Democratic growth in high education suburban areas.
Oh yes.
Like, for instance, again, these are partisan polls, so take it with a grain of salt. But there were two different Democratic polls that came out of Pennsylvania's first congressional district, which is one of the only Clinton won seats that's held by a Republican, Brian Fitzpatrick, that covers Bucks County and a few other parts of the Philadelphia area. It's a district that Clinton won by 2 points. Both these polls had Clinton or had Biden up double digits over Trump. Now, again, I don't, take it with a grain of salt. Partisan polls often will sort of overstate the their own side, but let's say that the real number is 7 or 8. That's still a significant improvement off of 2. And so if I'm Biden, I'm thinking, boy, how can I gain in the suburbs but not do even worse than Clinton did in sort of the outstate areas? The basically, like if you're looking at Pennsylvania, the greater Philadelphia area and Pittsburgh. Does that enter into the VP consideration at all? Now, I think that polling has basically indicated that, Trump's lead with non-college educated white voters, which is sort of the group that really powered his candidacy, he's doing fine with them, but not necessarily better than he did in 2016, at least not at this point. And, that to me is a formula for victory for Biden is, you improve in the suburbs, maybe you get better turnout and better performance amongst non-white voters, and you kind of hold the line in the places that are trending against you as the Democratic Party.
Yeah, I mean, that's the whole basis of my forecasting work was, this idea of, okay, we've got this long-term political realignment that's being powered by polarization, ideological sorting, and college-educated whites are going to continue to move left. Non-college educated whites are going to continue to move right. So like these Democratic strongholds in rural areas, and we continued to see erosion there. I mean, I think Dave Weigel put out a great piece after the primaries that showed continued erosion in Missouri of these white working class areas for Biden in a cycle where Trump is losing support even amongst those people, right? Because those union strongholds that used to be the bread and butter of the Democratic Party are no more. Where the Democrats are winning is college educated suburban areas. As the Republican Party has become anti-intellectual, anti-science, and anti-business, because frankly, a lot of these things are anti-business, it's the hunting grounds for votes really is transitioning into a different landscape, and nothing highlights that better than Texas, right? Where the Democrats are going to pick up probably at least 6 seats in the House, and have not yet recognized that 2 of those really could be these really concentrated races in Houston. They have picked up the 22nd district, which is a Dallas suburb, but the Houston districts are like 60% or 55% college educated. So I think it's really recognizing how much anti-intellectualism has bled the Republican Party of college-educated voters of all races, but even whites.
Yeah, Texas is, I think Texas is kind of certainly an interesting state in this election. Certainly not a must-win for Biden, but a must-win for Trump. And my understanding, and just based on public polls and other things I've heard, is Texas, I think, seems like it's very legitimately close. And the reason
Right.
it is it's I think probably that the presidential race is going to look something like the 2018 Senate race. And Beto O'Rourke was powered. You think of Texas, and the old, the thing about Texas was always, if the Hispanic vote turned out in much greater numbers, that would turn Texas into a blue state or whatever. And maybe that's part of it, but what really drove O'Rourke was the performance in the kind of places you talk about, those congressional districts that are kind of are suburbs and exurbs of big cities, the Metroplex, Houston, San Antonio, Austin, etc. And you really saw great improvement for O'Rourke there. And again, if the election were today, I think it might. I think what Cruz won by a little under 3 points, that might be kind of what we're looking at for Texas this time. And again, it's driven by those college educated suburbanites.
It's definitely going to be, because the Democrats have yet to the reason that we saw it only be that and not also be is that the Democrats really hardly invested in that Latino turnout side of the operation, right? So, if you saw like a really aggressive push for that Latino turnout, then it probably O'Rourke would have carried that race. But we only saw that suburban investment. And it is a product of 2 things happening. We have, some college educated whites who are realigning. I mean, many of them are independents more than Republicans, but there are Republicans who have left the GOP. That a lot of that exodus was as the party moved towards, from Palinism to Trumpism. There's been less exodus since Trump became the nominee and got elected. Like those people that voted for Trump in 2016, there's been a few that have left since then, but most of them have hung tight. So a lot of that erosion in the suburbs happened as the party moved to Trumpism. But some of them are there. And then there's independents in the suburbs have definitely shifted away from the GOP. And then a lot of it is activated millennials, because millennials are now 40 and they live in the suburbs and they were voting, but not in great numbers. And a lot of them were politically, frankly, being lazy about politics, and now they're motivated to vote, and it is reshaping the suburban landscape. And the suburbs of today are not the suburbs of the 1980s. They're much more diverse in terms of their demographics. So we're really looking at a suburban renaissance, and the 2020 election is going to look a lot like 2018. It's going to be a story of Philadelphia, the suburbs there, so under-delivered for Clinton due to lack of enthusiasm, that I just think people are really underestimating the potential of what those suburbs have to give in 2020.
One other factor here I think it's important to remember is that there were a significant block of voters, 6% of the whole electorate that, voted for someone other than Clinton or Trump in 2016. And those are the people I think you probably have to account for the most, in addition to obviously strong base turnout on both sides. But, if that group breaks one way or the other, that may ultimately end up helping to determine the election. And I doubt that a lot of those kinds of voters are big Trump fans at this point, although probably some of them are. There probably are some small number of libertarian protest votes who didn't think Trump would govern as a conservative, and he has, and so maybe they would go back to him. But if you're like me and you think the third party vote is going to be significantly smaller in 2020, that's a hunting ground for voters that, again, I don't think maybe gets talked about it maybe as much as it should.
Except for by me constantly ad nauseum, right? I talk about it all the time because it's the Achilles heel, right? No matter how much the polling shows Biden with this mighty lead. Ultimately what will determine whether he wins Florida or Ohio or Wisconsin or Pennsylvania is that percent Dem coalition versus the Republican coalition, and which side loses more voters, right? And why the Democrats lost so many voters to third-party protest balloting in 2016 was twofold. And I think you're right. Number one, a lot of it was atmospheric. So Clinton wasn't, attractive to a lot of the young voters, especially young white men. And so they voted for the libertarian guy who not only endorsed legalizing pot, but was like a very out and proud pot smoker. And that was a single issue for a lot of people. So they voted for Johnson. And, the Green Party candidate, of course. I mean, in Wisconsin, there was like 70,000 write-ins, right? And we don't know who they wrote in because they don't even count those. They don't record the write-in. But my guess is if I had been in Wisconsin and able to see those ballots, I'd have been seeing one name show up an awful lot in Wisconsin, and that name would have been Bernie Sanders, right? So, when we're talking about and the perception, of course, was every model was telling every voter, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan are 100% safe. They're going to go to Clinton. So your vote really doesn't matter. And Clinton's going to win the election. Everything's going to be fine. This time, no matter how much the data says, Biden's going to win, the psyche is people have PTSD. So they don't trust the data. They don't trust the polls. They are terrified that Trump's going to win. So they're going to bring they're not going to come into election day comfortable. And, I think that's going to hold down third party balloting a lot. But I also think that the negative partisanship and the fear factor, because it is hate. So like my research, people are like, oh, it's hate of Trump, but it is fear too. Like that's a big factor of negative partisanship, fear of what the other party's going to do to you. And I think the fear factor is really, really strong for a Trump second term. So I think that's going to drive up turnout a lot, and it's going to hold down third party balloting. But one thing that I've been trying to get people to understand is that and one of the reasons I've been kind of bearish on Parscale at least getting fired completely out of Trump world is they have designed and have been funding and putting into place for well over a year in their Death Star campaign, Death Star, an organization that's meant to micro target these under 30 voters with suppression, misinformation, and disinformation that's meant to tap into anger at the Democratic establishment. Biden is, a terrible person. He's a corporatist. He's just like Clinton. He's, Nancy Pelosi's evil, things like that to try to get, because they know if you have a guy that elected the first time without cracking 50% in almost any swing state, and he's never been above 50% in approval, even before his more recent compounding electoral woes, and you have to reelect the guy, like how do you do it? Well, you have to get that vote share, that winning margin down below 50%. The way to do that is you got to turn it into a third person race through third party voting. So the Trump campaign has been very shrewd about this. The GOP is excellent in electioneering, which is why I'm going to make that such a feature, part of my second episode, which is I'm going to shamelessly plug right now, going to feature Rick Wilson, famous GOP strategist, ad maker, chief brains behind the Lincoln Project. And I'm going to be having him on episode 2 called the Lean Mean GOP Campaign Machine. Rick does a lot of TV, but he doesn't do TV like this. We're going to be walking through how the GOP runs their campaigns, how they do electioneering, which is distinct from how Democrats do it, and how they're so effective at getting Republican voters to show up. So effective that in places like Florida, where they're significantly outnumbered and have been for a long time, they have controlled state politics for decades. So we're going to be looking at that, really getting into the nuts and bolts of how GOP campaigns so good. It's a master chess. So I'm really excited about that. I don't want to close out this episode, though, with Kyle on vice presidential picks without rehashing my very favorite vice presidential moment of all time. And I'm sure Kyle is going to remember this pretty quickly as I start to plug it. Of course, it would be, America's favorite vice presidential pick of all time. We've already mentioned her once on the episode, but there's a lot of younger people coming into the politics process now, so they may not know about Sarah Palin's great turkey shoot which occurred right after her failed bid for the vice presidency with John McCain in 2008. She went back to Alaska to do her job as governor. Just like presidents, you sometimes have to go and do a turkey pardon. So Governor Palin was standing there giving an interview about a turkey pardon. And she did a very gracious pardon of the turkey. Unfortunately for her, in the background, though, the turkey that she had recently granted such a gracious reprieve to was then fed into a food chopper behind her, making her one of America's first viral video stars. And so I always enjoyed showing this video to my campaigns and election students. And now that I don't have students, America, you're my students, I thought I would show it to you. Just a great moment in vice presidential politics. We don't get too many vice presidents like Sarah Palin, and she does live on forever. Speaking of bad VP picks, Kyle, I asked you to think about some of the other worst VP picks in history. What'd you come up with, buddy?
So the one that really comes to mind for me was Spiro Agnew in 1968. You talk about kind of a totally unvetted person. He'd only been governor of Maryland, I think, for a couple of years, and became kind of famous as being kind of an attack dog, particularly during Nixon's presidency, but ultimately had to resign for corruption reasons early in Nixon's second term. But it's one of the only occasions where I could actually remember the VP playing prominently in some campaign advertising. One of the really kind of funny campaign ads from that year and any year was it was basically you just see a television and it says Agnew is president or Agnew is VP, and the camera's panning out to someone watching on TV, basically just laughing maniacally at the idea of Agnew being president. And actually, a lot of people, my friend VP expert Joel Goldstein talks about Ed Muskie, the Democratic pick from that year, being one of the stronger Democratic VP picks in recent history. Now, of course, Humphrey didn't win that election against Nixon, but it did end up being relatively close, and it was kind of a weird year. So Agnew's one that comes to mind for me.
Yeah, I mean, I'm always a little partial to Cheney because he's my political, coming of age VP. I come out of my, selfish hippie years of doing rock and roll shows and partying, to pretty much come into the Bush years, and that's when I enrolled in my community college and started, studying political science. So I just thought that's how vice presidents were, that they were really important and that they were running, agencies and cabinets, and then I start studying political science and I realized that vice presidents are supposed to attend funerals and, wreath laying ceremonies, and that's about it. So it was kind of a surprise to me. And Cheney really was a, amazing vice president. And of course, I think it tends like you have to get a little years behind you before people really want to study something academically. So I think I'm really looking forward to my older years when the Cheney books start to come out and people are really dissecting that.
I actually think Cheney ended up being a pretty good pick. I mean, Bush was someone in 2000 who needed, I think, to reassure people that, that he was up for the task, that his administration would be up for the task. And, Cheney, I think, sort of conveyed that. Again, whatever one may think of him overall, but he was, if we were talking about sort of the stronger picks over time, I think Cheney probably be on the list.
Yeah, and you know what? That's a great segue too, because I meant to say this when we were talking about Pence. And it's so funny because when you talk to any Republican, especially analysts, they're always talking about how Democrats need these vice presidents that reach across the aisle, that appeal to moderates, right? But when you look at vice presidential picks, they never do that. They're never about that. And you never hear Republicans talking about winning the votes of Democrats. I mean, Cheney, Pence, right? And those are winning tickets, right? So I would think Democrats might want to look at that a little seriously. Kyle, it's been great to have you on the show. Obviously, we could spend a long time talking about this. Could you tell people a little bit about your work at Crystal Ball, where they might find it, and plug yourself a little bit for me?
Sure, happy to do so. I'm at the University of Virginia Center for Politics. We do the Crystal Ball newsletter at least once a week, sometimes more than that. If you're curious about it, our stories are at centerforpolitics.org/Crystal Ball. You also find our ratings for the Electoral College, the House, the Senate, governor's races, and our newsletter is free to sign up for. So if you just give us your email address, that's it. You can sign up and get it. And then I'm pretty active on Twitter, as Rachel is. and I am at K Kondik, K-K-O-N-D-I-K. And so, Rachel, thanks for having me.
Yeah, please give Kyle a follow. The crystal ball ratings are, gold standard. They've been accurate cycle after cycle. You just can't get any better than that. Kyle and Larry and their new colleague, J. Miles Coleman, too. Follow him. And it's just been such a pleasure to have you today on the premiere of the show. So thanks for taking your time to join me today.
And good luck with the show.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sure you'll be back.
I hope so.
All right, we are going to turn things over to you, the viewers, in this segment. The doc is in. And Rachel, as you know, in the lead up to this premiere, we asked folks to submit their questions for you, and the response has been just overwhelming. So let's jump in and see how many viewer questions we can knock out. And folks, please do keep them coming. You can submit your questions and feedback for Rachel at electionwhisperer.com. Here we go. Are you ready, Rachel?
I am ready, and hopefully we can get some of these queued questions too. So yeah, keep them coming.
Okay, first up from Michael Smith. He asks, how can we distinguish a good poll from a bad poll? In other words, what should we look for in a poll that tells us if it's reliable or not?
Michael, it's a great question. I got to let you know we're going to do an hour-long special on polling that will really get into the nitty-gritty here. But I'm going to point you guys now to N sizes, looking for polls that have a decent survey sample size. Anytime you see a poll down in the 300s, 400s, I mean, really, when we're looking at a national sample and it's in the 500s, you can statistically get away with that. I mean, that's why the survey firms are doing that. And there's other topics that I think reasonably you could argue having a 500 sample size is decent. For cereal brands, different cars, something like that. Horse race polling is a special breed because we're dealing with something called the margin of error. And when we're talking about an election that is going to be close, you really want to try to negotiate that margin of error to be as tight as possible. And when you're talking about a low end size, you're going to have a very high margin of error. And when you're talking about a presidential election, you're going to have a tight race. That really does compromise the, I think, substantive value of the poll. But again, we're going to do a whole episode on polling that's really going to get down into the nitty gritty. And it's going to actually, I think the big reveal about it is going to show you how much polling data is misused even by the biggest news agencies out there.
All right, on this topic of polling, we have another question from Noah Gordon, who is Noah L. Gordon on Twitter. He asks, why were the polls wrong in 2016, and is that being corrected in the current polls we're seeing now?
Yeah, this is also a good question. No, I'm going to tell you, a lot of people do confuse what was wrong and what wasn't in 2016. Number one, at the big top line, forecasting models got 2016 wrong, overestimating Clinton's likelihood of victory. And some of that is because the national polls predicted her winning a 3% popular vote margin. That is exactly what she won. And prior to 2016, even a political scientist like myself would have been very skeptical that a candidate could win by 3 million votes and still lose the Electoral College. Anyone who's saying, oh, I knew for sure that a candidate could do that, maybe their model covered that outcome, but it wasn't a likely outcome. Very unusual to, Al Gore is the big, receiver of Electoral College loss or the popular vote win. That was 500,000 votes, right? 3 million is a big spread. So we think about the forecasting models really being wrong. And the polls nationally actually had lower error rates than we'd seen in many other cycles. What really was wrong with polling was a lot of these state level polls. Again, N sizes are a big matter. But AAPOR, which is a big survey consortium that does quality survey, diagnosis after the election cycle, pointed to having overrepresented college-educated voters as a main reason why some of these state polls, not weighting by education, got it wrong. And in my own book, I look at the number of undecided voters. There was twice as many undecided voters heading into election day as normal. And it was a clear signal. I'm not going to say that I saw that signal headed into election day, but in my post-op, I definitely saw that what we really should have been talking about was high levels of uncertainty due to that very clear signal of an unsettled electorate. So polling, when it's done well, is actually really pretty decent. And the 2018 polling was very, very good. So we'll talk about polling in a whole Election Whisperer special. I'm really looking forward to that.
Well, this next question we are getting from quite a lot of folks. Actually, it's probably the question of the 2020 election cycle. And this comes from Jack Madden, who asks, could you do the effects of coronavirus, but more importantly, the effects of the Black Lives Matter protests on the election? He says, I think this will affect some states like Georgia and North Carolina, but it would be great to know your insights.
Yeah, this is great. So, the coronavirus pandemic economic collapse was emerging just as I released my post-primary update. And I said, it's too early to know how these things are going to affect. This was like March 23rd or 24th that I was posting that. But my argument was that ultimately my forecast had a huge advantage for Democrats the whole time, that I didn't expect it would change all that much, that it would probably exasperate the situation for Trump. And, that's exactly what we've seen. I don't expect that we're going to head into November showing Biden with 14-point, leads in Michigan. I think we might see some of these right-leaning independents who have moved away from Biden. I mean, this is really the difference, right? Or moved away from Trump. That's really the difference that we're seeing in those polls. Like Trump is generally at 43, 44, and right now he's at 41. And I think that some of that movement is coming from right-leaning independents who have been hanging with him all the way through all of these various things, the Russia investigation, the Charlottesville comments, the Ukraine scandal, and now with the pandemic, the economic collapse, the mismanagement of those things, and then the really terrible statements and posture through the response to the George Floyd murder has really pushed some of those people away. They moved last when the Hollywood Access video was released, and then they ended up going back to him and voting for him on Election Day. So we'll see. I know that the Biden campaign expects them to come back to Trump as well. So we'll be watching them pretty closely.
Okay, and let's go for one more here. We've got Will Rifkin, who's asking, why has South Carolina lagged behind North Carolina and Georgia in transitioning away from being a deep red state?
Such a great question. And this ties into my research. And for those of you who are longer followers of me, you will be very familiar with the theoretical, arguments in my research about realignment politics, about white college educated voters moving to Democrats, non-college educated whites moving away from them. And when we think about Virginia, which is ahead of North Carolina in terms of urbanization, that Washington, D.C., Northern Virginia area is now the political center of Virginia. And that used to be the Southwest of the Roanoke area. And so that has really changed Virginia politics, made it much more liberal. Charlotte, the research triangle in North Carolina is very powerful in North Carolina politics. And it's got more college educated voters, white and otherwise, because the suburbs are no longer full of white people, right? So it's kind of analysis has this vision of white voters in the suburbs, but really the story of suburban realignment is much more nuanced than that. But when we look at South Carolina, most of what's happening there is constrained to this Charleston suburbs. And South Carolina doesn't have like a Raleigh, Charlotte trifecta. It doesn't have a Northern Virginia. So, it could be competitive. What it really has going for it is this very strong, very robust African-American population and African-American nominee that is just terrific, right? And when you combine that with this environment that we're looking at, it's not a likely flip, but I would argue that it is more competitive than Kentucky. Well, that was such a great episode. I knew Kyle was going to be so much fun to have on the show talking about the Veepstakes. I can't wait till next week to have Rick on, picking his brain about those GOP campaign techniques. And those questions were fantastic. Like I said, I wanted to answer them all. We're going to keep picking out of the mailbag, put more in and give us your feedback on the show. Topics, questions, all kinds of things we'll be looking. They get submitted on the website, which is electionwhisperer.com. There's a form on there. It's really easy to use. And that's, of course, the only place that I'm going to be answering your questions and responding to your topic suggestions. So please use the website. I know it's really hard because Twitter has been such a handy tool for such a long time, but I really need it to all come through there. I'm a one-woman show, so I can only handle so many different lines of communication. I'm going to be joining now for the live chat, so I'm really excited to engage with you guys there. So yeah, and I'll see you guys next week.